Bonjour, bonsoir. My name is Omar Ali, and I am a professor of comparative African diaspora history at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro in the United States. And I also serve as Dean of Lloyd International Honors College at the university. I want to thank the conference organizers of Literary Landscapes, Forms of Knowledge in the Humanities. This is a presentation that I wanted to do in person, but I couldn't make it over to Paris this summer, and so I'm offering this video. The title of the workshop is Towards a Developmental Pedagogy of the Global African Diaspora, Practicing an Inclusive Methodology in Teaching, Learning World History as Performances. So there are multiple ways of teaching African and African diaspora history. Many focus on particular regions and time periods, drawing on primary sources that include written works, oral histories, images, and music, among other mediums. This presentation is a way of doing so with the framing and methodology that seeks to provide an interdisciplinary, broad, and inclusive scope in terms of content, geography, and time period. The approach is a practice of creating developmental learning environments that draw on epistemological and methodological insights from, among others, Lev Vygotsky, Frantz Fanon, Carol Dweck, Bell Hooks, Lois Holtzman, and Lenora Fulani, in combination with improvisational theater techniques. The content covers the global African diaspora, starting with Africa, then moving into the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Atlantic worlds from antiquity to the present. At the heart of this approach is a radical belief in an intentional posture towards others and one's own ability and willingness to learn in accelerated and deep ways. Here, teachers are learners, just as learners are teachers. And such an aspirational and encompassing historical and geographic framework and developmental approach is less definitive and predetermined than it is dynamic, co-creative, hopeful, even joyful. Put another way, it is about creating new kinds of conversations with others about world history, with a focus on the global African diaspora. So, how do we do all of this? I want to suggest that in one class, one can cover the entire scope of the global African diaspora. Now, of course, we're not going to be able to go as in-depth as we would during a course of a semester or a two semesters or even a 4-year of study. But I think it's important to keep it relatively simple in terms of creating a framework. And the way that we do that is by keeping, in some ways, the images, the words, the timeline into something that is manageable. Sometimes we can overwhelm our students with too much information and perhaps too many images. So a fundamental part of how I've been trying to teach for many, many years now, about over 20 years at university, has been to relate to my students as if they're curious, as if they're interested, as if they're engaged. And I say that because part of teaching is a kind of performance. And I think that if we relate to the best in our students, they in turn respond and they're more open as a result of that. That's just my experience. You have a better shot at helping your students learn if you have a posture of openness and relating to others, that is those students, as if they are all those things. Now, many of them are, okay, but many of them aren't. I teach at a public research university, which is the most diverse in North Carolina in the United States. And many of our students haven't had some of the opportunities to understand or learn and develop in their high school or pre-university education. And so they may come to the space without as much knowledge as some of the other students. I happen to be the dean of an honors college here, and so we have some of the highest ability students on campus. But I make sure to always teach general sections that include the broad spectrum of students that we have here. So I always think it's important to remember that our students come with some knowledge, but not as much as sometimes we might assume. So we want to define our terms. We want to give a basic chronology. We want to be able to bring in stories. We are natural storytellers. I think that the archaeological, or I should say anthropological and archaeological evidence suggests that we've been storytellers, for many tens of thousands of years. So we're in some ways hardwired in order to be storytellers and story receivers. So it's a way that we learn is by passing along things. For the vast majority of our species, existence on this planet as Homo sapiens sapiens, we've shared our knowledge through the oral traditions, right? Writing is a relatively new thing in terms of our species development, only going back maybe about 5,000 years at most. So we have stories of our own lives and stories of those who preceded us. So I want to try to offer you these things. When we're teaching about the African diaspora, I think it's good to go back to the Paleolithic to start our story, to give students a sense of the longue durée, right? The long stretch of history in which humans are part of. And so we begin in those times before we get to the Neolithic. And I think the Neolithic is where a lot of instructors start. But the Paleolithic, I think, offers us a kind of sense of humility. That is, our ancestors, going back to Homo erectus, essentially left Africa, first developing their skills in Africa proper, but left the continent somewhere around 60,000 years ago and populated much of the world as we come to know. So there are multiple hominid species. I mentioned Homo erectus, who were responsible for inventing fire or learning how to control fire, developing more advanced tools than Homo habilis, and then basically populating the entire world. Not the Americas at that point. It would be Homo sapiens that would make that juncture somewhere around 20,000 or so years ago, as we now know that that people had populated all the way down to Chile that long ago. So I begin with that because I think that we have to inspire our students with the sense of adventure and courage that our ancestors had in populating the world. Development of fire, that is controlling fire, was a huge development because it allowed our earlier ancestors to be able to go into colder climates, to be able to cook food and break down the food and make it more nutritious, and which allowed for us to actually grow our brains, which is an important part of the development of our prefrontal cortex, which allows us to imagine. So encephalization, which is the enlarging of the brain, the growing of the brain, was an important part of our human development. And I think that these abilities to control fire, to make certain kinds of tools, to develop the ability to have clothes and shelter, and then much later, not until about 12,000 years ago, do we have the Neolithic, where people become sedentary, agriculture development, and you see the beginnings of hierarchical society. But our ancestors really go back, to the tens of thousands of years that preceded the Neolithic, when people were figuring out how to move around and looking for food, looking for new opportunities, spreading ourselves out across the entire world. So when we talk about the African diaspora, I think that we have to go back in time, but we have to also take into consideration that people think about the African diaspora as something that's much more recent. And I think that that is obviously true. When we think of Africa and Blackness in particular, we think of a much more recent phenomenon. So I start in the ancient world, and the place that I start is with the area of the Mediterranean and the intersection of African civilizations coming out of Nubia and Egypt into the Greco-Roman world. From their vantage point, it's the Greco-Roman world. From an African perspective, it's an African world, or more specific, Egyptian. And so these general categories didn't mean the same thing in their times as they do us to this time in history, where we've constructed these geographic boundaries. In those times, and now we're talking about 2,500 years ago, people were part of larger complexes, the Mediterranean world, shall we say. Even the Greeks didn't think of themselves as all Greeks or all Romans as the same thing. They had a sense that they were part of an empire, the Romans, and they had an understanding of the center of the empire, but they identified with their own proper ethnicities outside of the Italic Peninsula. So you have this interaction of Africans coming out of one of the most ancient of the civilizations, that is the Egyptians, going back to at least 3200 BCE, before the Common Era, which replaces the idea of BC, which is before Christ, as a way of decentering sort of the Christian calendar, although it's still using the same timeline. But the ancient civilization of Egypt is one of a number. Of course, we know about Mesopotamia, which arises just before ancient Egypt, but is pretty much coming around at the same time as it's developing its city-states and its philosophies and astronomy and science and technology. And just a side note about science is I think it's important not to make the distinction that science is only a modern thing that begins, say, in the 17th or 17th century with Galileo and later on with Newton, but is something that builds on the trials and errors of many people before them that were certainly scientists, people in the ancient world who were mathematicians, engineers, people who were playing with notions of physics and certainly astronomy, which requires systematic observation, asking of questions, coming up with hypotheses, and then testing out those hypotheses. That's what science is, and that's what people were doing. So I think it's important to have a broader understanding of what it means to be doing science. So from that ancient Mediterranean world where you can talk about certain characters, and I say characters because we think about it as sort of a play, you can center stories like that of Candace Amanirenas, who was a Nubian queen who pushed back against Roman imperialism, and there's a wonderful head of Augustus that she captured, and she puts at the base of one of the temples and allows for any time anybody's going into the temple to essentially walk on the head of Augustus, which is a pretty clever thing to do, to say the least, showing her indignation for the Roman imperialist forces. And so that is actually located in the British Museum. Unfortunately, it's actually in the Greco-Roman section, although it should be really in the Egyptian or Nubian section of the museum. So you can talk about certain characters from the ancient world, whether that's Candace Amanirenas, or I also like to talk about Eratosthenes, the great director of the Museum and Library of Alexandria several centuries prior to that. And you can go on with other people. In the next period, I think that what I try to do is try to move into the Indian Ocean world. And again, I pick up certain characters. So for instance, Malik Ambar, somebody who I've written about, was an Abyssinian, an Ethiopian, who makes his way to India and then becomes the de facto ruler of one of the major kingdoms there, sultanates of Ahmednagar, who pushes back on the Mughals. So you can talk about Malik Ambar. You can also talk about the origins of Islam, because it's important to talk about the large spreading of Islam in this period of time in the figure of Bilal ibn Rabah, who was a contemporary, a companion, capital C, of the Prophet Muhammad, and is somebody who becomes the first muezzin, the person who calls to prayer. So we've talked about briefly Eratosthenes, Candace Amanirenas, Bilal ibn Rabah, Malik Ambar, and then I go from that Indian Ocean world, African diaspora, of which there were about 4 million people that were dispersed through both forced and free migration as sailors, as merchants, as soldiers, in a number of capacities. I moved then into the Atlantic world. And there I talk about Afro-Latin America. So you can point to certain figures like Bencos Bioho, the great maroon leader in Colombia, or New Granada, as they called it back then. Or you can point to also San Martin de Porres, who was an Afro-Peruvian saint, whose celebration is the largest religious ceremony in all of South America. You can also point to other figures that were part of that long tradition coming to the more contemporary period. So we move from from Africa proper to then the Mediterranean world, then going into the Indian Ocean world, moving to Afro-Latin America, and then to North America. So when students learn about African American history and the transatlantic slave trade, they learn about this much larger global context in which this is happening, where slavery looked differently in the Atlantic world than it did in the Indian Ocean world, where there was much more, if you will, possibility for upward mobility. So a figure like Malik Ambar was born a slave, but will become de facto ruler over time. So there was possibilities there, not so much for women in this way, but there were possibilities for men. So there are these heroic women that one can point to in the Atlantic world. And one of the greatest figures that one can talk about is Queen Nzinga. She was from the modern area of Angola, and she was somebody who's negotiating both against powers that were surrounding her fellow Africans, although they didn't see themselves as Africans per se, because they identify with their local tribal and ethnic identities, right? And she was negotiating with Portuguese incursions as well. And so using some video documentary, there's a new Netflix series, for instance, about African queens that's wonderful. I would even point to documentaries like Afro, Blacks in Latin America, which was done by Henry Louis Gates, who does a really good job with this particular documentary in capturing Afro-Latin Americans in Cuba, Brazil, Peru, and Mexico, among other places. And then you can use other video documentaries, and I use snippets. I use maybe 15-minute snippets. I stop, and then I have a conversation with students about what did you think? What did it make you think? What questions do you have? What is your response? And not just intellectual, but also emotional response to things. I also try to take students out of the classroom, so I take them to what we call the Underground Railroad tree here in the Guilford Woods of Greensboro, North Carolina, where it's a launching point of the Underground Railroad, which was African Americans in conjunction with white Quakers figuring out ways to support enslaved Black people to get out of the area into the north. I also take students to the local museum, the Greensboro History Museum, and every once in a while, if I can organize it, to bring students to the Woolworth International Civil Rights Center, where the 1960s civil rights sit-ins began famously. I take them to the Special Collections Library. And I also, every once in a while, play games in class. And this may seem silly, as I was mentioning several people who are coming out of improvisational theater world. Dr. Lois Holtzman, a very dear colleague of mine, has been using play and improvisation and performance to create spaces, as the early Russian psychologist and educator named Lev Vygotsky talked about, a zone of proximal development, where people who are more developed in one area relate to those who are less developed in that area, like language, language speakers is the classic example, as if they can speak, and to relate to people a little ahead of themselves. And I think we've all had that experience of when you're related to as somebody who can do something, you oftentimes kind of step up or step into that way, as opposed to people relating to you like you can't understand something. So we always want to relate to students as if they can understand something. So you can do that. You can also have students talk about themselves in the first person as a character, something I used to do in my days when I was adjuncting in graduate school at Columbia University. I did this at Fordham University in the Bronx. There are other things you can do, which is like reading a passage in the reading of the day together. You can read primary sources together, but literally out loud, like one person at a time reading one sentence, the next person reading the next sentence, or an entire paragraph, and being very affirming and supportive of students as they're reading, because not all students read in the same way, in the same capacity, but thinking of that as a performance, so telling them that they need to project and they need to speak slowly. So those are two things that you can do when you're doing a reading. So there's ways that you can make things engaging also by breaking up the class into smaller groups around a question, they can talk among themselves, because not all students are as willing to talk to a whole class out loud, but they are willing to talk among themselves in a smaller group. And then you can have somebody represent each of those groups, somebody who maybe feels more comfortable. And over time, I think people do get the skills to develop the confidence to be able to to speak out more on their own if they're a little bit more shy. So I always keep that in mind, that not everybody likes to speak out loud into an entire class. So you have to figure out ways of bringing students out and looking for the body language. Very important. As much as we do online teaching, it's also the case that you lose things, as in body language in particular ways if you're not there in person. You can convey a certain kind of warmth in person that's different than trying to do so by video. So those are some of the things that I do in trying to teach the global African diaspora. And my influences have included people like Lev Vygotsky and his understanding of zones of proximal development, where we grow through social interaction. The work of Carol Dweck, the psychologist who talks about the growth mindset, that that you're not quite there yet, instead of saying you got it wrong. So you're relating to students as if they're in process in their development, learning, and growth. The work of Lois Holtzman, as I mentioned, a key influence, who's introduced me into and worked with me alongside students and faculty here at UNC Greensboro, to infuse performativity, play, and improvisation into the classroom, to be more practical, philosophical, and to be willing to kind of take some risks and try some stuff and co-create. I think the key is to follow what is an improvisational theater called yes and, which is to acknowledge what somebody's giving you and build with it, as opposed to negating them or in fancy language, poo-pooing their idea, to try to figure out what element in there that you can build with. And that's a much more creative thing. It's easy to say, no, you're wrong. It's more creative and harder work to be figuring out, okay, what can I build off of this? And I think that's the work that we should be doing as teachers. So there are other figures. Foundational is Frantz Fanon, and the idea of that we internalize our surroundings, and I think in some ways centering the Black struggle internationally is always sort of should be at the forefront. That learning African and African diaspora history is not just a cognitive thing, learning the details of specific history, but it's also emotional, because learning things that are both traumatic for generations past and disturbing for us, for everybody, in terms of understanding what we've done to each other as fellow human beings, especially Black people of African descent, is an emotional thing, but also inspirational. And I think that we want to capture all of that and acknowledge that and build with that with our students, asking them, what they're thinking about something that we just read or that we just went over in class. The work of Bell Hooks, which is really about disruptive education, really breaking up the role of the teacher above and the student below, but seeing ourselves as co-creators of the knowledge. And I think that's really important. Vygotsky mentioned something that I think is really interesting. He uses this word in Russian called obuchnie, which means teach, learn. So it's that sort of interplay with teacher and student. Teachers tend to know more about the subject because we've just been doing it longer, but we have to do that in collaboration with students. And that's why it's important to yes and our students. And we'll always be surprised sometimes. Well, sometimes we'll be surprised, I should say, with students saying what they understand a reading is or an image is. And speaking of which, that's another thing I would do is, we have a lot to learn from art historians in the way they observe and can describe images of objects, as we can from ethnomusicologists, from understanding music as important as part of the human experience. But basically using those, a piece of music, a piece of an art, to understand a certain history. And the first thing that I think is important, to let people just observe and describe what they're hearing or seeing in particular, and letting the conversation flow out of that. So there are many, many influences, I think, here. And of course, I can't leave out the work of Lenora Fulani, who was a colleague of Dr. Lois Holtzman. And Dr. Fulani, who was just a phenomenal educator, always taught the importance of understanding that people's reactions to things are in part socially organized. And I think that she reminds me of the importance of centering the voices of ordinary people, and that means students, and not in some ways privileging those who have had a chance to have more access to education, but to also help people see things in new ways. And that means us being open as teachers to being shaped by our students and others. So I think that you can try to do a sweep of African and African diaspora history, see how that goes, use some chronological sort of markers. I think start in the Paleolithic, certainly start, continue in the Neolithic, have some key geographical and chronological touch points, use individual people to teach, from Eratosthenes and Kandake Manrenes to Bilal ibn Rabah to Malik Ambar to Benkos Bioho to San Martin de Porres, to more recently Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells in the African American tradition, all the way to Malcolm X, and Dr. Lenore Fulani, who herself was the first woman and the first African American to run for president and get on the ballot in the United States, running for U.S. president in all 50 states. That was in 1988. So I hope this is of some value to you. I know I've been speaking a lot, and I wish I could have done this in person in Paris, there at the Sorbonne, but I hope that this is of some use to you. And my email address is ohali@uncg.edu. Again, my name is Omar Ali. It's OHALI at uncg.edu, and you can just put UNCG as a shorthand for my University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and Omar Ali, and I should pop up pretty quickly. I would love to hear from you if you want to comment, or if there's anything that I can do to be of help in your own teaching. But I think sort of expressing your genuine sort of passion for the knowledge, for the information, what you've learned, what you've studied, what you've researched, what you've discovered in your own work, sharing that enthusiastically, and sharing that the enthusiasm of what students contribute to the conversation is really important. And I think yes and is a way of acknowledging and affirming, and then building off of that. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference offerings. Take care. À la prochaine. Merci beaucoup.